Three men in tactical gear slipped past a $10 million security grid at 2 in the morning, hunting the one person in that Mafia estate everyone had already written off as breakable, the Alpha boss's husband. The cameras had gone dark on command, the alarms never tripped, and someone with the same access as the boss himself had opened the door for the men sent to kill him. Nobody believed the pale, silent Omega upstairs could survive the night, let alone walk out of it holding the knife. So who let the wolves inside, and why did they choose the one target they should have feared most? Stay with us, because the truth behind that betrayal is darker than anyone expected. Pull up a chair for this one, because it's the story of Ren, the Omega an entire crime family dismissed as fragile, right up until he calmly ended a firefight with a kitchen knife and never raised his voice once. If you've ever been the quiet one nobody took seriously until you proved every single one of them wrong, we want to hear that story in the comments below. 3 months from now, a man will stand over a bleeding enforcer on an empty highway with a stolen gun in his hand, and the last thing that enforcer will ever learn is that the useless Omega he tried to erase was the only person in the family who could actually read a crime scene, a ledger, and a lie, all in the same glance. This is how it started. They called him the Porcelain Bride, a thin, nearly scentless Omega handed over to the city's most feared syndicate to settle a debt that was never his to pay. To the men who ran with the family, he was a punchline, a pretty, useless thing to be locked in a gilded room and forgotten. They thought his silence was fear. They thought his lowered eyes were surrender. They were wrong, every one of them. He wasn't looking at the floor. He was quietly measuring the distance to their throats. The collar of the tailored suit scratched at the back of Ren's neck. Italian wool, absurdly expensive, and it felt like sandpaper against his skin. He stood in the corner of the marble-floored ballroom, a champagne flute warming uselessly in his grip. He hadn't taken a sip. Across the room stood Kestrel, broad-shouldered, the fabric of his tuxedo pulled tight over muscle built for violence, jaw set, dark eyes sweeping the crowd with the paranoid precision of a man who knew there was a price on his head. He smelled of ozone and crushed cedar, an alpha scent so sharp it seemed to press the air out of the room and demand obedience from anyone who breathed it in. It gave Ren a mild headache. Look at it. The voice sneered over the rim of a lowball glass. Griffin Doyle, one of Kestrel's top enforcers, never bothered lowering his voice for anyone. Boss paid $5 million for a debt sponge. I've seen corpses with more color in their cheeks. A second man laughed. Barely even smells like an Omega. Dust and old tea leaves. What's the boss supposed to do with that? A strong wind and he'll shatter. Ren kept his eyes on the condensation sliding down the side of his glass. 1 drop. 2. It landed cold on his thumb. He didn't flinch. He was used to worse. When your own family sells you off to erase a gambling debt, you learn early how to separate the ego from the flesh. More than that, though, Ren understood the value of being underestimated. A fragile thing is an invisible thing. Kestrel finally found his eyes across the room. His expression didn't change. A flat, cold line, no affection anywhere in it. There was none to find. This was a transaction. Kestrel needed a legal spouse to lock down an offshore asset loophole before the feds could touch it. Ren's father needed his kneecaps to stay attached to his legs. Neither man in this arrangement had asked what Ren wanted, because neither man had thought to. Kestrel crossed the room. The crowd parted for him the way water parts for a blade. The cedar scent thickened, clinging to the back of Ren's throat. "You're quiet," Kestrel said. His voice was a low rumble, sanded down by cigars and years of shouting orders over gunfire. "I have nothing to say." A muscle in Kestrel's brow twitched. "Barely a millimeter. Don't let Doyle hear you cry. He feeds on it." "I'm not crying. No." "You're just standing there like a ghost." Kestrel checked his watch. Heavy gold, unnecessary. 1 more hour, then we leave for the estate. Don't cause a scene." He turned and walked away before Ren could answer, which was probably for the best, because Ren didn't have an answer that wouldn't have cost someone their fingers. He breathed in the stale ballroom air and let it settle. He didn't care about Doyle's insults. He didn't care about Kestrel's coldness. What he cared about were the 2 service exits at the back of the room, the single main entrance, the 4 visibly armed guards, and the 6 he guessed were working the perimeter unseen. The chandeliers hung from brass chains, not steel, useless as anchor points if things ever went wrong in here. He took a sip of the warm champagne. It tasted like battery acid. He swallowed it anyway. 3 weeks into the marriage, the silence of the estate had become its own kind of violence. The house was a fortress dressed up as a mansion. Bulletproof glass floor to ceiling, biometric locks on every interior door, a perimeter wall crowned with wrought iron spikes that looked ornamental and were in fact filed to killing points. Ren spent his days haunting the East Wing like a well-dressed roomer. He'd been given a platinum card he never used, and a closet stocked with cashmere he wore only because the house was kept ice-cold year-round. The staff treated him with a careful blend of pity and polite contempt. The guards, mostly alphas, a few heavily built betas, didn't bother adjusting their posture when he passed. To them, he wasn't a threat. He wasn't a boss's spouse. He was a piece of furniture that happened to walk. Kestrel himself was a phantom. He left before dawn, smelling of dark roast and cold air, and came home long after midnight, smelling of blood and stress, the cedar under it gone sour with exhaustion. They slept in the same enormous bed. An ocean of high-thread count sheets kept carefully between them. Kestrel never touched him. Ren never asked him to. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kitchen thick with the smell of roasting garlic and rosemary, when Doyle decided to remind Ren exactly where he stood. Ren was at the marble island with a heavy paring knife, peeling potatoes in long, unbroken ribbons. Footsteps echoed on the tile, uneven, deliberately heavy. Doyle leaned in the doorway, chewing a toothpick reeking of cheap cologne and manufactured menace. "Playing house, princess?" Ren didn't look up. The blade glided smoothly under brown skin. "Boss is hitting a warehouse tonight," Doyle went on, drifting closer. "Real work. You wouldn't know the first thing about that. You'd probably faint at a paper cut." He reached out and shoved the bowl of peeled potatoes, sending it skidding toward the edge of the island. Ren's hand shot out and caught the rim an inch before it went over, not spilling a drop of the water inside. He set it back down without hurrying. Doyle's toothpick stopped moving. The reaction had been too fast, too clean for someone who was supposed to be half asleep on his feet. Ren finally lifted his eyes. Pale, washed-out hazel met Doyle's stare. There was no fear in them. There was no anger either, just an empty, hollow quality that raised the hair on the back of Doyle's neck for one unwilling second. "Please don't interrupt my work," Ren said softly. "The starch settles if the water spills." Doyle covered the flicker of unease with a sneer. "Freak. Don't wait up for the boss tonight. He'll be busy scrubbing somebody's blood off his boots." He left. Ren looked down at the knife, ran his thumb along the flat of the blade. Perfectly balanced. Full tang, good steel. He went back to peeling. That night the storm broke. Rain lashed the reinforced glass of the master bedroom. Thunder rattled the floorboards. Ren lay awake in the dark, the clock glowing red. 2:14 a.m. Kestrel wasn't home. His nose twitched. He knew the scent of this house the way other people knew a song. Floor wax, expensive leather, the faint ozone hum of the air purifiers. But underneath it, filtering through the vents, was something new. Wet wool, mud, gun oil, and a spike of sour. Artificial adrenaline, the smell of men working themselves up for a kill. Ren sat up, silk slid off his chest. He didn't reach for the lamp. He listened. A soft thump from the floor below, the unmistakable squeak of tactical boot rubber on wet marble. The perimeter had been breached. Ren slid out of bed. His bare feet made no sound on the hardwood. His heart rate didn't spike. It slowed, a familiar, icy calm sliding through his veins like it had been waiting for permission. He crossed to the walk-in closet, bypassed the rows of designer suits, and reached to the top shelf behind a stack of unused hat boxes. His fingers found the cold plastic edge of a hidden lockbox. 4 digits, keyed by feel in the dark, click. He pulled out a suppressed compact pistol and a curved karambit knife, checked the chamber by touch, a heavy hollow point round waiting patiently in the breech. And didn't bother with shoes. Shoes made noise. He wore a loose black t-shirt and cotton sleep pants and slipped into the dark hallway. There should have been 4 guards on interior night shift. Ren smelled copper and fear-loosened bowels near the top of the stairs. The guards were dead. Whoever had done it was professional, quiet, fast, and they knew the camera blind spots, which meant they'd had help from inside. He flattened himself against the wall above the sweeping staircase and looked down into the foyer. Lightning flashed, and for one white-hot second, he saw 3 figures in tactical black, suppressed submachine guns raised, moving toward the west wing, toward Kestrel's office. They're after the ledger, he thought, or they think Kestrel is home. One man stopped and signed something with his hand. 2 words, easy to read even in the dark, the Omega. They wanted no witnesses, and they'd been told he was easy. One of them broke off and started up the stairs. Ren didn't retreat. He waited. The intruder crested the top step, reeking of cheap chewing tobacco and damp sweat, and swept his barrel toward the shadow where Ren stood. Ren moved first. He stepped inside the arc of the weapon instead of away from it, his left hand snapping out to seize the hot suppressor and shove it upward. The gun barked once into the ceiling, tearing plaster. In the same half-second, Ren drove the karambit up and in, slipping the curved blade between the plates of the man's vest and into the soft tissue beneath the arm, severing the artery there. The man made a wet, terrible sound. Ren twisted the blade free and brought the pistol's heavy pommel down across the bridge of his nose. The intruder dropped, and Ren eased the body down quietly instead of letting it fall. Downstairs, the other two spun toward the muffled noise. Ren scooped up the dead man's submachine gun, heavier than his own pistol, slick with rain, and stepped fully into view on the landing. He fired in tight, controlled bursts, not sprays. 2 rounds, center mass, into the nearest man, who crashed backward into a porcelain vase that shattered into 1,000 pale shards. The third man screamed and fired blind up the stairs. Splinters exploded off the banister an inch from Ren's face. A hot line traced across his bicep as a round grazed him. He didn't flinch. He dropped the empty gun, raised his pistol, and tracked the man as he dove behind a leather sofa. Silence fell, thick and ringing, broken only by rain. Ren descended the stairs, his bare feet finding the spreading pool of the first man's blood, warm, sticky, smearing across polished wood. "You're dead. You little bitch," the man behind the sofa shouted, voice shaking. He could smell blood and death everywhere, but the copper stench had swallowed whatever thin scent Ren carried. He couldn't smell his target at all. "You tracked mud onto the rugs," Ren said, "perfectly level." And the words rolled out across the cavernous room like a verdict. The man fired blind over the couch. 3 rounds thudded into drywall above Ren's head, and Ren crossed the last of the distance on silent feet, listening to the leather squeak as the man shifted his weight, triangulating the sound. He didn't go around the sofa. He aimed at the center of the heavy backrest, exactly where a crouching man's chest would be, and fired 3 times through the leather. A choked gasp, a heavy thud, then nothing. Ren walked around to find the man staring sightlessly at the ceiling, blood pooling into the pattern of an antique rug. His own arm stung where the graze had opened, blood tracking down to drip off his fingertips. That was when the front doors burst open, wind and rain howling into the foyer, and Kestrel stood in the frame soaked to the bone, weapon drawn, a dozen men flooding in behind him. They had been tipped off. They'd expected a slaughter. They froze instead, staring at a war zone. Plaster dust hanging in the air, blood-soaking imported rugs, 3 trained killers dead on the floor, and in the middle of it, standing perfectly still, was Ren. Torn shirt, blood on his arm and his bare feet, a smoking pistol in one hand, a bloody knife in the other. Kestrel lowered his weapon slowly, his eyes wide with something between shock and disbelief. His alpha scent spiked, panic, then confusion, then, underneath it all, an unwilling thread of awe. Ren turned his head. The hollow, lifeless expression he usually wore was gone, and in its place was something feral, cold, and entirely unfamiliar to anyone who'd ever called him harmless. He looked down at the blood on his feet, then back up at his husband. "We're going to need a new rug," he said quietly. The ringing in Ren's ears didn't fade right away. It sat behind his eardrums, a high electric whine drowning out the wind through the open doors. He looked at the pistol in his hand, barrel still warm, slide locked back and empty, and let it hang loose at his side. Kestrel's men broke from their paralysis and flooded the foyer, tactical lights slicing the gloom, boots splashing through puddles of rain and blood. Secure the perimeter, check the basement. Shouts bounced off the vaulted ceiling. Ren didn't move. The cold marble seeped into his bare feet. The dead man's blood had begun to congeal between his toes, tight and uncomfortable as it dried. Kestrel approached the way a man approaches an unexploded device, slow, careful, eyes never leaving Ren's face. His scent, usually a hard wall of cedar meant to push the whole room back, had frayed at the edges into something thick with shock and a confusion he didn't try to hide. "Ren." His voice barely carried over the noise. Ren blinked. The cold, feral clarity in his eyes receded, folding itself back behind the flat, dull gaze he'd worn since the day they met. The one behind the sofa fired a blind burst up the stairs, he said, quiet and a little raw. It ruined the drywall. Kestrel stopped 2 feet away and looked at the blood tracking down Ren's arm. You're hit. It's a graze. Leo. Kestrel barked it over his shoulder without breaking eye contact. Get the kit. Now. A slender beta with a heavy black duffel pushed through the crowd of armed men. Leo, the syndicate's underground doctor, more accustomed to pulling bullets out of thighs on kitchen tables than to scenes like this. He took one look at the carnage, then at the delicate-looking Omega holding a bloody combat knife, and swallowed hard. He approached carefully, snapping on gloves. Let me see the arm, sir. He reached out, and Ren's body reacted before his mind caught up. His right hand twitched, the karambit rotating upward into a defensive arc. Leo scrambled back over the rug, hands raised. Whoa, whoa! Ren clamped his own wrist and forced his arm back down. His chest heaved once. The adrenaline was finally draining out of him like bathwater, leaving something cold and hollow behind. His knees felt like wet sand. His hand, still locked around the knife, began to shake, a fine, humiliating tremor. He hated this part. The violence itself was easy. It was just physics, geometry, timing. The aftermath was his body demanding payment for time borrowed against itself. Kestrel saw the tremor. He saw the slight buckle in Ren's knees. Everyone out. The command was low, but it cut the room like a blade. I said, get out of the foyer. Take the perimeter. Clear the bodies later. Out. His pheromones spiked hard enough that the air itself seemed to taste of metal, and the men didn't argue, dragging Leo with them and pulling the heavy doors shut against the storm. Silence returned, broken only by rain against shattered glass. Kestrel looked at his husband, really looked. The boy he'd bought for $5 million to sit quietly in a corner was shaking, clutching a bloody knife, standing over 3 professional corpses. Drop the knife, Ren. His voice had softened, reaching for a calm he clearly didn't feel. My hands are stuck. It was the plain truth. His muscles had locked, the death grip a biological failsafe he couldn't override by wanting to. Kestrel stepped into his space without asking permission. He wrapped his large, calloused hands over Ren's small, blood-slick ones, hot, almost alarmingly so. Breathe out. Ren exhaled, shaking. Kestrel pressed his thumbs into the nerve clusters at the back of Ren's hand until the fingers uncurled and the karambit clattered to the marble. He took the empty pistol from the other hand and set it on a console table. Walk, he said. Ren tried, but his left foot dragged, the adrenaline crash hitting its peak. Before he could stumble, Kestrel's arm wrapped around his waist, half carrying him past the bodies and down the long hallway to the east wing, leaving wet red footprints on polished wood. He took Ren to the downstairs master bathroom, where the lights flickered on too bright against white subway tile, and the smell of bleach and lavender soap jarred hard against the copper stench that clung to them both. Kestrel sat him on the edge of the tub, opened the cabinet, and pulled out a first aid kit himself, instead of calling Leo back in. He knelt on the cold tile, his expensive trousers soaking up the water dripping from Ren's clothes. Who taught you to fight? Ren watched him uncap the hydrogen peroxide. My uncle. Your uncle runs a low-level numbers racket. He's not teaching anyone to gut a man in the dark. My other uncle, Ren said quietly, correcting him without heat. He owed money to a cartel across the southern border. They took me as collateral when I was 14. I was supposed to be a domestic, a cleaner. Kestrel's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering under his skin, the cotton pad hovering over Ren's arm. You didn't clean. I did. Ren's hazel eyes lifted to meet his, and the terrifyingly empty look was back. I cleaned up the people they didn't want around anymore. For 3 years until my father bought me back. Kestrel poured the peroxide over the cotton without another word. This is going to burn. He pressed it into the graze. Ren didn't make a sound, didn't even blink, just watched the bloody foam bubble over his own skin, breathing perfectly evenly. Kestrel wiped it away, his hands steady for a man whose empire had just been breached. 3 men heavily armed, in the dark, and you took all 3 apart. They were sloppy, Ren said, mechanical. They telegraphed the approach, wet wool and cheap tobacco. They assumed I wasn't a combatant. I assumed you weren't a combatant. You assumed I was a ledger entry. It wasn't an accusation, just a correction. I let you assume it. It's safer to be furniture. Kestrel finished taping a square of gauze over the wound and didn't stand. He stayed kneeling, looking up at the pale, exhausted man on the edge of the tub, and felt the axis of the room tilt under him. He was the boss of the city's largest syndicate, a man who broke kneecaps and ordered executions before breakfast, and he had never once, in this moment, felt more out of his depth. "You're not furniture anymore," he said. Ren looked away toward the white tile. That's a shame. It was a very quiet life. The morning sun did nothing to warm the syndicate's war room. Buried beneath the main estate, the bunker-like office was paneled in dark mahogany and smelled of stale cigar smoke, old leather, and nervous alpha sweat. 6 capos sat around the long oval table, Kestrel at the head, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The silence was heavy enough to choke on. Bodies had been cleared, rugs rolled up and burned, but the psychological wound remained. A fortress had been breached, and the top of the syndicate was, for the first time in a long while, afraid. It was the Kovacs. Silvio, an older, heavily scarred alpha, muttered, tapping a gold pen against the table. "Has to be. They've been pushing on the waterfront shipments for months. It's not the Kovacs." Doyle snapped, pacing behind his chair, tie undone, his scent spiking with agitation. "The Kovacs use explosives. They make noise. This was surgical." 3 ghosts got past a $10 million security grid. He stopped and leaned over the table, staring straight at Kestrel. "And what I want to know, boss, is how the hell your pet Omega is the only one who walked out of that foyer alive." Kestrel's eyes darkened, a low growl vibrating in his throat. "Watch your tone, Doyle." "No, with respect, I won't." Doyle's voice rose. 4 of my best perimeter guards are in body bags. The interior cameras loop for 90 seconds at 2 a.m., and 3 hitters get inside, and we're supposed to believe the quiet debt bride took them all out alone? He laughed, harsh and ugly. "He's a mole. He let them in. He's working with whoever hit us." The heavy door clicked open. Every head snapped toward it, hands drifting toward concealed holsters. Ren stood in the doorway in an oversized gray cashmere sweater and soft cotton trousers, his left arm wrapped in fresh white bandages peeking from a rolled sleeve, his pale hair still damp from the shower. He looked small, he looked fragile, he looked exactly like the useless Omega they'd mocked for a month. But the room didn't relax. Instinct screamed at every alpha at that table, short-circuiting logic. They were looking at an Omega, and every hair on their necks was standing up anyway. Ren carried no scent of submission. No fear radiated off him at all. He walked into a room full of armed, furious mobsters with the casual indifference of a man strolling into an empty kitchen. Kestrel didn't tell him to leave. He just watched. Ren walked to the table, ignored Doyle entirely, and stopped beside Silvio, looking down at the crime scene photos scattered across the wood. "You shouldn't be down here," Doyle sneered, stepping in to loom over him. "This is family business. Go upstairs and play with your closet." Ren didn't flinch as Doyle crowded his space. He didn't even look up. He reached out with his uninjured hand and tapped a fingernail against one photo. "They weren't Kovacs," he said, soft but perfectly clear in the dead silence. "And they weren't ghosts. Listen here, you little." Doyle reached to grab his shoulder. "Doyle." Kestrel's voice cracked like a whip. "Touch him and I'll remove your hand at the wrist." Doyle froze, hand hovering an inch from the cashmere, then backed away, red-faced. Ren slid the photo to the center of the table, a close-up of the man who died behind the sofa. "Look at the boots," he said, tone empty of any feeling at all. "Meridian tactical soles, but the laces have been swapped for 550 paracord. Look at the knot, a left-handed square knot, tucked under the tongue." The capo stared. Silvio pulled on reading glasses. "So what?" "The man on the stairs," Ren went on, sliding a second photo forward, smelled of cheap chewing tobacco on top, but underneath that, pine tar. His weapon was a compact submachine gun, but the suppressor was custom-threaded, not factory. Milled from titanium. He looked up, hollow hazel eyes sweeping the table of hardened killers, and none of them held his gaze more than a few seconds. It was like staring into an empty well. You don't buy titanium suppressors on the street. You have them machined, and pine tar is what riggers use on shipping docks, specifically the eastern docks. "The eastern docks are Conland territory," Silvio whispered, the color draining from his face. "Conland's allied with us," Doyle argued. Though his conviction was thinner now. "We have a truce. They wouldn't break it." "A truce is just a pause to reload," Ren said flatly. "The man I killed on the landing had a tattoo on his inner forearm, mostly burned off with a laser, but the scarring left the outline. A Celtic cross wrapped in barbed wire. Conland's heavy hitters. The room fell into a silence you could have cut with a knife. Kestrel stared at him. "You noticed the knot on a dead man's boot in the dark during a firefight. I noticed it when he was bleeding out on the rug, Wren said, flat and exact. I had to step over him. Doyle leaned on the table, knuckles white, losing control of a narrative he desperately wanted to hold on to. Fine, say it's Conlan. How'd they beat the biometric grid? The alarms never even tripped. Wren turned his head, finally acknowledging Doyle the way one might acknowledge a smear of dirt on a clean window. They didn't beat it. Someone with level 4 clearance shut the perimeter grid off for exactly 90 seconds at 2:10 a.m. I checked the router logs on the mainframe upstairs, while all of you were still yelling at each other. He let the silence stretch until it was ready to snap. There are 3 people in this syndicate with level 4 clearance. He looked at Kestrel. You. He looked at Silvio. You, head of security. His empty eyes drifted at last to Doyle. And you. Doyle exploded, slamming both hands on the table, leaning in with spittle flying. Are you accusing me, you little freak? I've bled for this family 10 years. You've been here a month spreading your legs for a paycheck. Wren didn't move, didn't blink. I'm not accusing you, Doyle. I'm stating a mathematical probability. He leaned in slightly, resting his good hand flat on the mahogany. If you're innocent, you have nothing to fear. If you're guilty, I know where you sleep. It wasn't an alpha barking dominance. It was a promise, low and even from something that lived comfortably in the dark. Doyle's aggressive scent soured with a sudden, unmistakable spike of real fear, and he took a step back from the table. Kestrel stood. He didn't look at Doyle. He looked at his capos. Lock down the eastern docks. I want eyes on every Conlan lieutenant by sundown and pull every server log we have. If anyone tampered with that grid, his voice dropped to a glacial calm, I'll skin them alive. He dismissed the room with a flick of his wrist. The capos filed out fast, avoiding the Omega standing calmly by the table. Doyle left last, shooting Wren a venomous, terrified glare before slamming the door behind him. Kestrel and Wren were left alone in the heavy quiet. Kestrel walked around the table and stood close, cedar scent returning, though it had changed. No longer a wall meant to push people back, but something curious, protective. You just put a target on your own back, Kestrel said quietly. If Doyle's the rat, he's coming for you. Wren looked up. The hollow look cracked for a fraction of a second, showing something tired and cynical underneath. I know, that's the point. I'm sick of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Let him come. 4 days passed. The syndicate went to a war footing, the estate locked down tighter than a military base, bristling with anxious, heavily armed men. The physical cost of the firefight had finally caught up with Wren. The adrenaline crash had given way to deep muscle stiffness. His left arm was nearly useless, a purple bruise blooming outward from the gauze all the way to his elbow. He hid it under oversized sweaters, the pain a constant low hum in the back of his skull. It was 1 a.m. The house was quiet except for rain against the glass, a lingering remnant of the storm that had ended their brief false peace. Wren stood in the master bathroom, the door unlocked, hot water running in the marble sink until steam fogged the mirror. He'd taken off his sweater and stood shirtless under the harsh light, a pair of medical shears in his right hand, clumsily trying to cut away the old blood-spotted bandage on his bicep. His right hand didn't have the angle. The tape kept tearing at his skin, and his breath hissed through his teeth in frustration. A shadow fell across the doorway. Wren froze, his hand dropping, and met Kestrel's eyes in the mirror. Kestrel stood in dark slacks and a white shirt, sleeves rolled up, holster still strapped across his chest, exhausted, dark stubble shadowing his jaw. He said nothing at first. He just looked at Wren's back reflected in the glass. Wren had hidden his body meticulously since the day he arrived. Now the harsh light showed everything. Thin white surgical lines crisscrossed his shoulder blades. A puckered circular burn scar sat just above his left kidney. A long, jagged line trailed from his lower ribs down toward his hip. They weren't the scars of a trained soldier. They were the scars of someone who had survived a slaughterhouse. Something tightened, hard and sudden, in Kestrel's chest. Territorial instinct crashing headlong into a deep, sick guilt. He'd bought this boy assuming he was untouched glass. He hadn't understood the glass had already been shattered and glued back together with blood, years before he'd ever laid eyes on him. "You're making a mess of that," Kestrel said quietly, and stepped inside. Wren spun instantly, crossing his right arm over his chest, eyes flicking to the doorway, measuring the distance to it. "Stop!" Kestrel raised both hands, palms open. "I'm not a threat. Stop calculating how to kill me." Ren forced his muscles to loosen, lowered his arm. I wasn't. You were. Kestrel stepped closer to the sink and took the shears from his hand, not pulling, just waiting until Ren let go. He set them down. Sit on the counter. Ren hesitated. The marble was cold, but the throb in his arm was making him nauseous, and the effort of holding his guard up was wearing him down to nothing. He hoisted himself onto the edge of the vanity, bare feet dangling. Kestrel stepped between his knees, an impossibly intimate position for two men whose marriage had begun as a business deal signed in blood money. The heat off his body cut through the cold marble at Ren's back. The smell of dark roast and cedar wrapped around him, but for once it didn't choke, it grounded him. Kestrel's hands were surprisingly gentle as he found the edge of the tape and peeled it back slowly. I pulled the server logs, he said, eyes on the bandage. Routed through a proxy, but the authorization code belonged to Silvio. Ren's brow furrowed. Not Doyle. No. Kestrel pulled away the last of the bloody gauze. The wound underneath was raw red at the edges, but not infected. Silvio's man confessed. Said Conlan bought him off months ago to leave a blind spot in the grid. Did he confess willingly? Kestrel looked up, dark eyes meeting his. No, and he's dead now. Kestrel reached for a fresh bottle of antiseptic. The math doesn't add up, though. Conlan isn't smart enough to run a silent hit like that. He's a thug. Brute force is his whole style. Someone else is pulling strings, using his men and our blind spots. He sprayed the antiseptic. Ren hissed, gripping the marble edge hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Kestrel stopped and, without thinking, lifted his free hand and gently gripped the back of Ren's neck. An instinctual gesture, an alpha grounding a mate in distress. His thumb pressed into the tense muscle at the base of Ren's skull. Ren went utterly still. The touch sent something electric through his whole nervous system. It had been years, a decade maybe, since anyone had touched him with intent to comfort rather than command or hurt. The warmth of Kestrel's hand made a strange, unfamiliar ache bloom behind his ribs, a buried human need clawing toward the surface. He hated it. Don't, he whispered, his voice trembling. Kestrel pulled his hand back immediately, expression tightening with regret. Sorry, just finish the bandage. Ren looked away, fixing on a crack in the tile. Kestrel unwrapped fresh gauze and worked quickly, wrapping the bicep tight but careful, securing it with tape. If it's not Conlan pulling the strings, Ren said, forcing his voice back into cold analytical rhythm to smooth over the awkward silence, then someone in this house is feeding them our structural weaknesses. Doyle, Kestrel said, stepping back to give him room. He's aggressive, not stupid. Ren slid off the counter, picked his sweater back up, pulled it carefully over his head. He's trying to consolidate power. He wants you dead, and he wanted me dead too, so there'd be no heir and no obstacle to the accounts. I can't kill a capo on suspicion, Ren. Kestrel dragged a hand over his tired face. The other families would revolt. I need proof. Concrete, undeniable proof. Ren adjusted his sleeve. The scent of lavender soap and copper had faded, replaced now by Kestrel's cedar tangled with Ren's own faint dusty note, which Kestrel noticed properly for the first time actually smelled like dry autumn leaves and cold stone. Not weak, camouflaged. Then we give him an opportunity, Ren said calmly. Kestrel frowned. What do you mean? Ren looked at him, the cynical exhaustion in his eyes sharpening into something lethal and clear. Doyle thinks I'm a fluke, thinks I got lucky. He walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. Tell the capos you're moving me to the safe house upstate. Tell them I'm traumatized. Tell them I'll be traveling with a skeleton crew. Kestrel's blood ran cold. You want to be bait? I'm a piece of meat you bought to balance a ledger, Kestrel. No self-pity in it, just fact. Might as well put the meat where the trap is. No. Kestrel's alpha instinct flared violently. Absolutely not. I'm not throwing you to the wolves. Ren turned fully around, hazel eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made the bigger man take a breath before he answered. I'm not the sheep, Kestrel. His voice dropped to something soft and certain. I'm the thing the wolves are afraid of in the dark. Let me off the leash. The night before Ren left for the safe house, he couldn't sleep, and instead of lying awake counting exits in the dark, he went down to the kitchen and started peeling potatoes he had no intention of cooking. It was a habit now, not a chore. His hands needed something precise to do while his mind ran through everything that could go wrong on a stretch of interstate he hadn't seen yet. He didn't hear Kestrel come in. He smelled him first, which meant Kestrel had let him. You don't have to do this, Kestrel said, leaning in the same doorway Doyle used to lean in, though it felt like a different room entirely now that someone else occupied it. I know I don't have to. Ren didn't look up. The blade moved in one clean ribbon. I'm choosing to. That's not the same as being fine with it. Ren set the knife down and finally met his eyes. You've spent your whole life running toward gunfire because it's yours to run toward. I've spent mine running from it because it was never mine to survive. It just kept finding me anyway. He picked the knife back up. For once, I get to choose the ground. That's not nothing. Kestrel crossed the kitchen and, for the first time since the wedding, reached out first, not to stop him, not to grab him, just to still the hand holding the knife, thumb resting lightly over Ren's knuckles. If it goes wrong, he said low, I'm not going to be 2 hours behind you. I'm going to be right there. You can't be. That's the whole plan. Doyle needs to believe it's a skeleton crew. I know what the plan needs. Kestrel's jaw tightened. I'm telling you what I need. Ren looked down at their hands on the counter, his pale, scarred, blood familiar. Kestrel's broad, warm, deceptively gentle for a man who'd killed more people than Ren had years alive. Something in his chest, the same unfamiliar ache from the bathroom, stirred again, and this time he didn't tell it to stop. Then don't be 2 hours behind me, he said quietly. Be exactly as fast as you can be, and trust that I'll still be standing when you get there. Kestrel didn't answer with words. He pressed his forehead briefly to Ren's temple, just long enough for the cedar and the dry leaf scent to tangle together in the cold kitchen air, and then he straightened and walked out without looking back, because if he looked back, he was fairly sure he wouldn't be able to let Ren walk out that door in the morning at all. Ren finished the potatoes anyway. He didn't cook them. He just needed his hands to remember, one more time, what it felt like to make something whole out of something that could easily fall apart. What neither of them said out loud, because saying it would have meant admitting how much they'd already come to rely on each other, was the arrangement Kestrel had made an hour earlier with two men neither Doyle nor Silvio knew by name. A second, unmarked car, plain plates, no syndicate markings. A driver who'd worked convoy security for a senator before he worked it for the mob would shadow the armored SUV at a 2-exit distance for the entire drive north, close enough to respond, far enough to stay invisible to anyone watching for a tail. It was the only concession Kestrel had managed to negotiate out of a plan he still hated. A tracker, no larger than a coin, was sewn into the lining of Ren's sweater collar, feeding a live signal to a laptop on the shadow car's passenger seat. It wasn't nothing. It just wasn't enough, and both of them would learn exactly how not enough it was before the day was through. The heavy doors of the armored SUV slammed shut, sealing Ren into a vault of dark leather and recycled air. He sat in the back, watching the estate blur past behind tinted glass, gray stone and wet pavement in the early morning fog. 2 guards rode up front, Silas driving, a young nervous beta named Carter riding shotgun, both of them radiating stale coffee and anxiety, their scents thin and sour compared to the heavy alpha presence Ren had grown used to. Kestrel stood on the front steps, watching the vehicle pull away. He didn't wave, he didn't move. He just stood there, hands buried deep in the pockets of his black wool coat, and Ren watched him until the SUV cleared the iron gates and the mist swallowed him whole. ETI to the safe house, 2 hours, sir, Silas said, eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror. Don't call me, sir. Ren pulled the collar of his sweater up. The heater blasted, but the cold he carried lived in his marrow, not his skin. They hit the interstate as the sun tried and failed to burn through the overcast sky, the road a slick black ribbon cutting through dense, ancient pine. The tires hummed hypnotically on wet asphalt. Ren closed his eyes but didn't sleep. He ran the mental math of the road instead, 4 lanes narrowing to 2, blind curves, elevation changes. He already knew exactly where the strike would come. If he were Doyle, he'd choose the switchbacks near the old quarry. No cell reception, deep ravines, a perfect place for an accident. 50 minutes in, Carter's voice dropped an octave. Hey, Silas. Black Tahoe, 2 cars back. Been pacing us since the toll booth. Ren opened his eyes and checked the speedometer instead of the mirror. 80 miles an hour. Lose them, Silas muttered, knuckles white on the wheel, and the armored SUV surged forward. There's another one, Carter's voice spiked with panic. Coming up the left flank, fast. Ren braced his good arm against the door handle and pressed his feet flat to the floorboard. Silas, do not brake, he ordered. his voice perfectly level against the chaos erupting up front. "They're trying to box us." The impact was a physical thunderclap. The Tahoe on the left slammed into their rear quarter panel, metal shrieking as the heavy SUV fishtailed on the wet road. Silas fought the wheel, cursing, the vehicle careening toward the concrete median. A third vehicle, a reinforced pickup, pulled out of a hidden logging road directly ahead. "Brace!" Silas screamed, slamming the brakes. The anti-lock system stuttered. It wasn't enough. The SUV T-boned the pickup at 60 miles an hour, airbags exploding with deafening force, the cabin filling with the acrid smell of burnt propellant and hot radiator fluid. The vehicle lifted off its rear tires, hung suspended for one terrible weightless second, and rolled. Glass shattered despite the reinforcement. The frame groaned under its own crushing weight. Ren was thrown against the door, the seatbelt biting into his collarbone as the world spun in a chaotic smear of gray sky, black asphalt, and deploying curtain airbags. When it finally stopped, the vehicle lay upside down in a muddy ditch. Silence descended, heavy and ringing. 2 exits back, in an unmarked sedan doing 90 on the shoulder, the tracker signal sewn into Ren's collar blinked once on a laptop screen and went dark. Not a clean shutdown, but the jagged, cut-off flatline of a transmitter that had just been crushed under several thousand pounds of rolling steel. The driver didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just pressed the accelerator harder and got Kestrel on the phone, and from that moment on, for the better part of 25 minutes, Kestrel would have no way of knowing whether the man he'd promised to be right there for was alive, dying, or already gone. It was the longest 25 minutes of his life, and it was the reason that later, when he finally reached the wreckage, whatever composure he'd built over a decade of running a syndicate simply wasn't there to find. Ren blinked. Blood dripped into his left eye, stinging. He tasted copper and dust, hanging upside down as the seatbelt slowly cut off circulation to his legs. He turned his head. In the front, Silas and Carter had gone completely still, the roof caved in on their side. Raw gasoline crept through the cabin, thick and nauseating. He didn't check their pulses. He knew dead flesh when he smelled it. He reached up with his right hand, fumbling for the release with numb fingers, pressed the button, and let gravity claim him, crashing down onto the interior roof, his injured arm taking the worst of the fall, pain flaring white-hot from bicep to jaw. He curled into himself among the broken glass, biting down on a low hiss. Outside, the crunch of heavy boots on gravel. "Check the cab. Make sure it's done." Ren forced his eyes open. No gun. The karambit was back at the estate. He was unarmed, bleeding, trapped in a metal box. Beside his knee lay a jagged 12-inch shard of reinforced window glass, coated in Silas's blood. He wrapped his sweater sleeve around the base to protect his palm and gripped it tight, dragging himself toward the shattered rear window and slipping out into the cold mud of the ditch just as a flashlight beam swept the front windshield. The pine forest was freezing. Damp earth soaked through Ren's cotton trousers instantly as he crawled up the steep embankment, away from the burning wreckage. He didn't run. Running left deep footprints, broke branches, made noise. He moved with a slow, agonizing fluidity, sliding between thick trunks, letting the shadows swallow him. Below, on the highway, 4 men circled the overturned SUV carrying short-barreled rifles, reeking of wet wool and synthetic gun oil and the particular arrogance of men who'd never once considered losing. "He's not in here," one shouted, shining a light into the empty back seat. "Then find him." Ren recognized the second voice and went still, pressing his spine against the rough bark of a pine. Doyle. He hadn't just planned this, his ego had demanded he come watch it happen. He needed the absolute certainty of seeing the useless Omega dead in the mud with his own eyes. "He's bleeding," Doyle called up the hill. "Follow the trail. He's a house pet, he can't get far. Shoot him in the legs. I want to talk to him before he bleeds out." 3 men started climbing, flashlights cutting erratic swathes through the gloom. Doyle stayed by the road, leaning against the dented Tahoe, lighting a cigarette. Ren looked at the glass shard in his hand, an imperfect weapon. It would break against bone. He'd need soft tissue only. His breathing stayed shallow and controlled. His left arm hung useless at his side. Stitches torn open by the crash, warm blood pattering onto dead pine needles. He wiped it against his dark sweater to break the trail. A flashlight beam swept inches from his face. The first hunter, a heavy-set alpha relying entirely on his eyes and his weapon, walked past without noticing the wind had shifted. Ren waited until the man was 3 full paces ahead. his back fully turned, and then pushed off the balls of his feet. Not a graceful lunge, a brutal, desperate tackle. He crashed into the back of the man's knees, and as the alpha buckled forward, Ren's right arm swept up, driving the shard into the side of the man's throat below the jaw, punching it deep into the artery and snapping it sideways. The glass shattered. Hot blood sprayed across the ferns in a wide arc. The man collapsed, choking, hands at his own ruined throat, and Ren didn't stay to watch. He grabbed the dropped rifle by the strap and rolled behind a rotting log, back into cover. "Mick, you got something?" A second hunter approached. Ren checked the rifle by feel in the dark, safety off, selector on semi-auto. He couldn't raise it to his shoulder. His left arm couldn't take the weight, so he braced the stock against his hip, resting the barrel on the log, and waited. The man found his friend's body and froze, flashlight illuminating the gore, terror spiking off him a full second before he could shout. Ren pulled the trigger. The crack of the unsuppressed rifle rolled through the trees, scattering a flock of crows into the gray sky, and the round hit the man's center mass, dropping him into the mud. "Contact!" the third man screamed, firing a wild automatic burst into the trees. Bark exploded above Ren's head, showering him in splinters. He pressed his face into the wet dirt, smelling rot and gunpowder, calculating. The man was panicking, firing blind, 20 yards out, moving right. Ren crawled on his elbows and knees, abandoning the log, dragging the rifle with his good hand, his left arm a screaming pillar of fire threatening to drag him under. He bit the inside of his cheek until it bled, using the fresh pain to anchor himself, and flanked the third man as he fumbled a fresh magazine into his weapon with shaking hands. Ren stood behind a birch tree, leaned his right shoulder against the white bark to steady himself, raised the rifle one-armed, and fired once. The bullet shattered the man's knee. He shrieked and collapsed into the brush, his gun flying from his hands. Ren didn't finish him. He let him scream. Screaming men draw attention, and attention was exactly what he wanted next. Down on the road, Doyle threw his cigarette away, pulled a heavy .45 from his shoulder holster, and started up the embankment, his arrogance gone, replaced by a dark, murderous rage. "You little freak!" he roared into the trees. "You think you can hide from me? You think you're smart?" Ren leaned against the birch, panting, his vision graying at the edges. He checked the rifle's magazine, 3 rounds left, and let it drop to the forest floor. Too heavy. He unholstered the compact 9mm from the third man he'd shot instead, lighter, faster, and stepped out from behind the birch. He didn't hide anymore. He walked slowly, unsteadily, down the sloping terrain toward the highway, his sweater soaked through with mud and blood, pale hair clinging to his forehead. He looked like something that had clawed its way out of a grave. Doyle stopped in his tracks as Ren emerged from the mist. He was breathing hard, gun raised, hands trembling. He looked at the fragile Omega, then at the blood trailing behind him, and then into those pale, dead hazel eyes. 2 men, Doyle breathed, voice cracking. "You killed 2 of my best with a piece of glass and a stolen rifle." "One's just missing a kneecap," Ren corrected, voice a dry rasp. "You should get him a tourniquet." Doyle snarled, raising the .45, aiming for Ren's chest. "I'm going to blow a hole through you, you worthless parasite. You ruined everything. I had the families lined up. I had the Eastern Docks. Kestrel is soft, letting the Empire rot, buying a debt sponge instead of building alliances." "Kestrel isn't soft," Ren said slowly. "He just assumes people have basic decency. It's a tactical flaw." "It isn't softness." "Shut up," Doyle's finger tightened on the trigger. Ren didn't raise his 9mm. He kept it pointed at the dirt by his thigh. "You're holding your gun too tight, Doyle. You're trying to control the recoil before you've even fired. You're going to pull your shot low and left." Doyle's eyes flicked to his own grip for a fraction of a second, a fatal psychological mistake. Ren raised his weapon and fired twice in rapid succession. The first bullet caught Doyle in the right shoulder, spinning him back as his .45 discharged wildly into the dirt. The second caught him in the thigh, and he hit the ground hard, screaming, clutching his shattered shoulder. Ren walked the rest of the way down, legs like lead, and stood over the bleeding enforcer. Doyle looked up, face pale, his alpha scent entirely swallowed by the sharp stench of his own fear. For the first time, he looked at Ren not as an Omega, but as a predator. "Don't!" Doyle begged, coughing, blood on his lips. "Don't do it. We can make a deal. I have offshore accounts. I can give you millions. You don't have to go back to him." Ren stared down at him, something tearing quietly at his insides. Part of him wanted to run, take the money, and finally be a ghost with no master. He'd been bought and sold his whole life. He owed Kestrel nothing. Kestrel was just another man holding his leash. But looking at Doyle, he remembered Kestrel's warm hands carefully unwrapping his bandages, then pulling back, apologizing for the touch. He remembered him, standing frozen on the front steps in the cold, watching the SUV disappear, his scent thick with an anxiety he hadn't been able to hide. Kestrel didn't own him. Kestrel was the only person who had ever offered him a quiet room and asked for nothing in return. "I don't need a deal," Wren whispered, and raised the 9mm to the center of Doyle's forehead. The unmarked sedan had reached the wreck 11 minutes earlier, its driver radioing the dead tracker's last known coordinates to Kestrel, while he was still 4 exits south, doing 110 with his own convoy struggling to keep pace. 11 minutes was long enough to find the overturned SUV, long enough to find Silas and Carter cold behind shattered glass, long enough to find the blood trail leading up into the pines, and to lose it twice in the dark before a second team with a tracking dog finally picked it back up. It was not long enough to find Wren. By the time Kestrel's convoy screamed around the bend, the Shadow team had already radioed ahead with everything they knew, which amounted to 2 words that had done nothing to slow his heart rate. "He's bleeding." The wail of sirens and the roar of engines rolled down the highway. 3 black sedans tore around the bend and slammed to a halt behind the burning wreckage. Kestrel was out of his car before it fully stopped, vaulting the guardrail, coat flying behind him, weapon drawn, his alpha pheromones flooding the air in a suffocating wave of pure panic and rage. He froze at the edge of the scene, the burning cars, the dead men in the front seat, the blood trail leading into the trees, and Wren standing in the middle of the road, covered in mud and gore, gun pressed to the head of his own traitorous right hand. Kestrel lowered his weapon, chest heaving. Wren didn't turn his head. His finger stayed on the trigger, his hand beginning to shake as the adrenaline crash came roaring back. "He confessed," he said flatly, voice carrying over the crackle of the burning SUV. "He coordinated with Conlan. He wanted the Empire." Kestrel walked forward slowly, stepping over the debris, and stopped beside him, looking down at Doyle, who was weeping openly now, begging silently with his eyes. "Put the gun down, Wren," he said softly. "If I put it down, he goes to a hospital. He buys a lawyer. He buys a judge. He comes back. No, he doesn't." Kestrel's voice went cold, harder than the asphalt beneath them, "because this is my family, and I clean up my own messes." He raised his own weapon. Wren looked at him, saw the grim, uncompromising violence in his eyes, a violence born not of cruelty but of necessity. For the first time, he didn't see a warden standing there. He saw an equal. He lowered his gun and stepped back. Kestrel didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger once. The echo rolled through the valley and faded into the heavy silence of the pines. Kestrel holstered his weapon without looking at what was left of Doyle. He turned to Wren, who was swaying now, the adrenaline entirely spent, leaving nothing behind but pain and blood loss. Wren's knees buckled. He didn't hit the ground. Kestrel caught him, arms wrapping tight around his waist and pulling him flush against his chest, not caring about the mud or blood soaking into his coat. He buried his face in the crook of Wren's neck, breathing in the faint, dusty scent of autumn leaves underneath the copper and gunpowder. "I told you not to be the bait," he murmured, voice trembling slightly against Wren's skin. Wren let his forehead rest against Kestrel's shoulder. It was warm. It felt safe, and the walls he'd spent a decade building didn't shatter, not all at once. They just lowered an inch. "I caught the rat," he whispered, eyes sliding shut. "The ledger's balanced." "Forget the ledger," Kestrel said fiercely, lifting him off his feet, carrying him away from the wreckage toward the waiting cars. "You're never balancing a book for me again." As they walked away from the carnage, Wren didn't look back. For the first time in his life, he didn't have to watch his own back. Kestrel didn't hand him off to Leo in the back of the sedan, though Leo tried twice, hovering with a fresh field dressing and a bag of saline. Kestrel kept Wren against his chest the entire ride. One hand pressed flat over the reopened stitches in his arm, the other braced along his spine, as if letting go for even the length of a bandage change might be the thing that finally lost him. Wren didn't argue. He was past the point of arguing with anything, drifting in and out of a gray, formless exhaustion that no longer bothered pretending to be composure. "The tracker died," Kestrel said at some point, quiet, more to himself than to Wren. In the crash, I didn't know if he stopped. He didn't finish it, and Ren, half-conscious against his shoulder, understood anyway, because he'd spent his whole life reading the things people couldn't say out loud. "I know," Ren murmured. "You came anyway. I was always going to come anyway." By the time the sedan turned through the wrought iron gates, dawn had started bleeding gray light across the estate's stone face, and the guards at the perimeter, the same men who used to let Ren pass without adjusting their posture, snapped to full attention as the convoy rolled to a stop, several of them actually stepping forward to help before Kestrel's look sent them straight back to their positions. He carried Ren inside himself. He always would from that morning on, whenever there was carrying to be done. The monster in the dark was carrying him home. 3 weeks later, the estate smelled different. Someone, Ren, though he never admitted it out loud, had opened the windows in the east wing for the first time since the marriage began, and the house had traded its cold museum air for something that actually moved. Leo cleared Ren for light duty and then immediately regretted it, because light duty turned out to mean Ren sitting in on every capo meeting with a legal pad and a fountain pen, cross-referencing shipment manifests against the Eastern Docks customs filings, until he found the second name buried under Conlan's, a shell corporation registered to a cousin of Ren's own father. That was the twist nobody in the war room saw coming, least of all Ren. His father hadn't just sold him to clear a gambling debt. He'd sold him to Kestrel specifically, 3 years after learning Conlan wanted a foothold inside the syndicate and didn't have the bloodline to get one. A cleaner's hands were easy to sell as fragile ones, and a fragile spouse was easy to place exactly where a war would eventually need him, as a fuse or as a scapegoat, whichever came first. Ren's father had been betting both ends of the same board the whole time, expecting to collect no matter who won. Ren read the Shell Corporation's paperwork twice, in silence, at 2 a.m, and didn't say anything for a long time. Kestrel found him there at the war room table, the lamp throwing a small gold circle over the documents, and didn't ask if he was all right, because he'd learned by now that Ren answered better questions than that one. "He'd have sold me twice," Ren said finally. "Once to you, once to whoever burned this house down first. He doesn't get a third try." Kestrel pulled a chair around, not across from him, but beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "That's not a threat. It's a fact. Same as the ones you deal in." Ren almost smiled, almost. "You're learning my language. Someone has to speak it back to you. They didn't dismantle Conlan's operation in a single dramatic night, the way it might have gone in a story with less patience for consequences. It took 5 weeks, 3 quiet arrests the police were allowed to make, and one that they weren't, and a closed-door sit-down with the other families where Kestrel didn't raise his voice once, because Ren had already handed him a folder that made raising his voice unnecessary. Silvio, cleared once the real trail surfaced, kept his position at Kestrel's side, though he was noticeably more careful about checking his own access logs after that. Ren's father was never seen at the estate again. What happened to him afterward wasn't discussed at the dinner table, and Ren didn't ask. Some ledgers, he decided, were better left to balance themselves quietly, out of sight, the way debts like his always should have been handled from the start. The house kept changing in small ways. Ren still wore the cashmere, but he stopped wearing it like armor. Kestrel still left before dawn most mornings, but he'd taken to leaving a second cup of coffee on the kitchen island before he went. Black, no sugar, exactly the way Ren liked it and never once had to ask for. Neither of them called it romance. Both of them understood without saying so that it had become one anyway, slow, wary, built out of bandages and gunpowder and one very stubborn refusal to let the other one bleed out alone on a highway. 6 months after the gala, where a room full of hardened criminals had laughed at the porcelain bride standing quietly in the corner, Ren stood in that same ballroom for a different event. A peace summit between 3 families who had, until recently, wanted each other's blood on the marble floor. He wore a suit that fit him properly this time, and he stood exactly where he wanted to stand, not tucked into a corner, but at Kestrel's right hand, where every capo in the room could see him. Nobody in that ballroom called him useless anymore. Nobody dared to sneer over the rim of a low-ball glass within earshot. They'd all read the same reports by now, the same crime scene photographs annotated in Ren's own careful handwriting. The same closed case files, with his conclusions written into the margins in ink instead of blood. A few of the older capos, the ones who still remembered Doyle's voice carrying across that first war room, had taken to standing a little farther back whenever Wren crossed a room, the way careful men give space to whether they respect, but don't fully understand. Kestrel found him by the window, near the end of the night. The city lights spread out below them, and stood close enough that the cedar and the dry autumn leaf scent tangled together into something that belonged to neither of them alone anymore. "Regretting the quiet life yet?" he asked. Wren considered it, watching the lights, feeling the weight of a hand settle at the small of his back like it had always belonged there. "Ask me again," he said, "once it's actually quiet." Kestrel huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. "You'll be waiting a long time for that." "I know." Wren tipped his head back against his shoulder, close enough now that it didn't feel like a calculation anymore, just a place he wanted to be. "I've gotten good at waiting. It's the one skill nobody ever had to teach me." He paused, and for once the pause wasn't tactical at all, just a man deciding slowly that he was allowed to say the next part out loud. "I don't mind waiting here, though. With you. That part's new." Below them, the last of the capos were filing out toward their cars, and somewhere in the syndicate's ledgers, the real ones, the ones Wren kept now, in his own hand, in ink that never had to be balanced with anyone's blood but the guilty. A debt that had once been priced at $5 million had long since stopped being a debt at all. It had become, without either of them quite agreeing to the terms, something neither man had ever been offered before, a life worth defending on purpose by someone who'd chosen to stay. If Wren's story kept you glued to the screen, tell us in the comments the exact moment you stopped underestimating him. We genuinely read every single one. A like and a subscribe means more stories like this find their way to you, and we cannot thank you enough for spending this time with us.